Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 81 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Joining me today is Colonel Rosemary Sheldon. Colonel Sheldon taught history as a professor at Virginia Military Institute for more than 25 years and is a world-renowned expert on intelligence activities in the ancient world. She earned her PhD from the University of Michigan and has published several books and many articles over the years, as well as serving as an editor for the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, Small Wars and Insurgencies, and the Journal of Military History. I invited Colonel Sheldon onto the podcast after reading her book, Intelligence Activities in Ancient Rome: Trust in the Gods, but Verify. I've wanted to dive into the topic of intelligence collection and espionage in the distant past for quite some time now, and I knew immediately that Rosemary would be the perfect person to learn from. But before we dive into this story of espionage in the ancient world, I want to say a big thank you to everyone listening who is also supporting me on Patreon, including Max E. and Christian S. Your monthly contributions there help me keep this podcast going week in and week out. As a way of thanking my patrons, I offer a lot of great freebies and promotions, including free and discounted books and products from the Spycraft 101 store. Patrons also get exclusive access to long-form articles of mine that aren't available anywhere else. If you haven't signed up for my Patreon yet, but you want to, just click the link in the show notes on whatever podcast platform you're listening to right now. Rosemary, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Justin. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. I appreciate it. I have to be very honest with you up front and say that I am really out of my element on this topic because I have not spent much time at all studying ancient history, let alone the history of intelligence in the ancient world. Most of my time has been focused on the 20th century, as my listeners already know. So I'm really glad for the chance to kind of change it up here and talk to you about something that I know so little about.
Well, that's a good thing because I have spent my entire career trying to popularize this topic, not with the academic community, but with the general public, with military historians, with the intelligence community, and people who may not be familiar with classics history in general, but also then wouldn't know much about espionage. And I've had to delve into the sources to find the information.
Good. Well, I'm glad to help you spread the word a little bit more to anyone who might not already be familiar with your work and who's listening in right now. So since you spent your whole career working on this, what was it that pushed you towards intelligence activities in the ancient world in the first place?
In reality, it was serendipity. I can look back and make it sound like it was one big master plan in my head, but it was just a series of things that were, at the time, unconnected. I did my master's degree at Hunter College with a man named William Sinnigan, who wrote several seminal articles about the Roman Secret Service. So I read them. Then I went on to the University of Michigan. I took a course on Byzantine history. I had to pick a topic for a seminar paper, and so I picked espionage and an intelligence collection in the Byzantine Empire, and then again dropped it. And then fast forward, I took a course on intelligence and security in World War II, and the professor began the course by saying, intelligence is so old, it went back to the Elizabethan period. And I said, time out. It goes back a lot farther than that, at least to the Roman. Really? Tell me about it. And so in our discussions, he said, have you thought of getting this material together and giving a course on it? And I hadn't thought about that, but let me see if I can find a textbook. And before you know it, I was teaching a course in the evening school at Georgetown University. And then it got picked up by American University and George Washington University. And in all of the material, I found that the Roman Empire, actually Republic and Empire, was the most poorly treated area. And so I decided to do my doctoral dissertation on that subject. And that it was the tome that became the book that you read.
My gosh, I can see how one thing led to another, and that's really fantastic. That because I see that kind of like the fruits of your labor with all of the different books that you've written and all the journal articles that you've written as well. I mean, your name is completely connected with ancient world intelligence, as far as I can tell from my brief few weeks of research here recently.
As far as I know, I'm the only person who's made a career out of it. Lots of people have written an article. Some people have either written a book, but then they go on to something else. Whereas I've stayed with it because no sooner do you finish a book, then you see a gap someplace else and you fill it in. And I my very first book was called Espionage in the Ancient World, an annotated bibliography. And I wrote it because people asked me, where do you get your material? And so I decided to collect it together, what I knew at the time, in one volume, so I could say, here, buy this. This is where I get the material. But then that was in 2001. This is now 2023. I'm updating it, and I'm amazed at how much more has been written. And I'm pleased because I asked in the introduction there, I cannot do it all. What you need is an expert in each field, whether it's ancient, medieval, Renaissance, who has the background training and the language training to research espionage in those periods. And so I was hoping somebody else would make it a home industry in their specialty.
Hmm. And in the end, it just turns out to be you. That's fantastic.
Well, no, it's not just me. Some people have jumped on the bandwagon, and there have been many, many articles written. For example, in the medieval world, there's a bit of a trend, and there have been other things written in the Roman world. But there's so much to do. I have not run out of material yet.
Oh, okay, okay. Well, that's great to know. So, on that note, how difficult have you found it to dive into this topic because it is so old? I mean, it's literally millennia old at this point. Is it very, very difficult compared to more modern stuff to research? I mean, I would imagine that there's like a fairly limited number of original sources out there, but is that what you found yourself?
I heard a phrase recently that it said it's like braiding soot.
Oh my
you
gosh.
know, it really, you think you have something in your hands, it disappears. Doing ancient history, compared to modern history, is hard because you're dealing with inscriptions and coins and ancient texts that are broken. You have a little piece of information here and a little piece of information there, and you have to pull it together into some kind of coherent story. In a way, it's a lot like being an intelligence analyst even today. You get a little bit of intelligence from here, a little bit from there. You have to put it together and see what the enemy's doing and hope that you're putting the story together correctly because you never have all the information you need. And
Oh, that definitely rings true.
right. The only difference that intelligence analysts have to come up with a conclusion right now because there may be a war or the president wants an answer, whereas I have all the time in the world to mull over these things. And so you collect. Another thing that makes it easy for me is if you know what you're looking for, it's there. If you don't know what you're looking for, you can skip right over it. I mean, after all, the area of Greek and Roman studies, has mushroomed. For 200 years, people have been going over these texts, but they're looking for other things. They're reading literary studies, they're looking for verb forms, they're looking for inscriptions, but you have to be looking for spies to find spies.
Hmm.
But once
Hmm.
you know what you're looking for, you see the footprints everywhere.
Interesting. Interesting. That makes perfect sense. So on that note, because so much time has passed, do you anticipate that there are any like major revelations that are still to come, or is it just like new documents that might be uncovered, or based on I don't know, archaeological projects or anything like that, or do you think it's just a matter of continuing to go through what has already been uncovered to this point, just using your own trained eye to do so?
Well, I can give you a good example. In the 1980s, Yale University did an excavation at a place called Tel Elan in Syria, which I'm sure at this point, if it hasn't been destroyed, is inaccessible. And the first 10 documents they pulled up out of the records room that they uncovered, two of them were about spy exchanges.
Wow.
So
Wow.
anytime you have a document that gets found that talks about diplomatic exchange, about a war, or is a message that got sent from one place to another, there's a chance that it'll have to do with intelligence. Inscriptions are found every day. Papyri are dug up in Egypt or turn up in other places. Manuscripts even turn up in libraries that people didn't know they had them. So there's always a possibility that new information will come. It's not going to pour in. This is not the modern world where you have tons and tons and tons of archives, but new stuff does turn up, and of course you can always look at the old stuff from a different point of view.
Okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense, especially things turning up in archives that nobody really knew was even there or understood the significance of it to begin with. So that sounds like you still have a lot of opportunities to come if you continue to pour yourself into this, I guess, and people in the future that continue to study this as well.
Hmm. Another example, between the time I wrote the dissertation and the time I published the book that you read, I graduated in 1987, and I had written a chapter on the Battle of the Teutoburger Walds in Germany with Varus. And they, at the same year, had found the actual site of the battle, or they claimed they did. So before I published the book, I had to get on a plane, go to Germany, look at the site, rewrite the chapter, and then the book could be published. So I guess you could say it's sort of hot off the presses, hold everything. We have to go look at this site, and indeed, finding the actual site of the battle changed the whole story of what happened and whether or not the sources were correct.
Amazing. I bet that was a great feeling to go and see the site yourself and have the most up to date information, even on something that happened so long ago.
It was spooky, and also it made me understand how the ambush was set, because as I was walking along the path, I realized it was so easy to do. I could have set up an ambush there.
Oh,
Germans picked the exact right spot.
amazing. So, on the subject of espionage in ancient Rome, did the Roman Empire take intelligence collection very seriously at the time? I mean, was this a major, major factor in their overall success over the years or over the centuries?
I argue in the book that, of course, we cannot judge them by modern standards. By modern standards, they were terrible at it. But that's not the question. The question is, by the standards of their own time, were they any good? They seem to lag behind people in the Near East, in the Middle East, but that's because Rome started out as a republic. And although they didn't have an intelligence service, they had individual people spying on each other. Everybody's slaves were potential spies that could be sent out to watch something or listen to something. So they had the mindset of, looking at other people. But when it came to watching enemies who were far away, they were very new at the imperial adventure. And they had to learn slowly, and they got better at it. Sometimes you can't find exact proof in an archive of what the Romans thought. They didn't keep, foreign policy notes saying, oh, we seem to be getting better at this. But what you can look at is the longevity of the empire. They lasted 1,000 years. They must have been doing something right.
Right. I mean, their record kind of speaks for itself in that way. But at the same time, like you just mentioned, they took a totally different approach, though, to what we do now. So, can you talk about their approach and how it compared to some of the other like tribes or empires that were around them during that same time period? Like, what were they doing differently from the others?
Because they were an empire and because they were centralized, it gave them a tremendous advantage over people who were not. Intelligence could be collected by the government and by the military, and there was I wouldn't say a whole lot of coordination, but more than you would find, let's say, in a tribal situation. The Romans could have had more people doing it, but then they could have had a lot more people doing almost all of the governmental tasks. They had two consuls that ran all the political and military functions of the Roman Republic. How do you do that with two people? By the end of the Republic, they had added people who could act in place of a consul, and that in Latin is proconsul. So they have a proconsuls. They added a few more people in each department, but it was never a bureaucracy. And that's one of the big differences between the ancient world and the modern world. They had offices, they had groups of people working on things, but bureaucracy is a modern concept where you have hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands people working in an organization. The CIA has to have at least 1 million people working for it all over the globe. The Romans just didn't have that many people. At the height of the empire, the people who worked as frumentarii, which is one of the organizations they founded, had about 200, slightly over 200 people for the entire empire.
Oh my gosh.
That's not a lot. They're spreading as good as they may have been. Another thing we should remember about the Romans is they had 28 legions. And when you have 28 legions, you don't need a whole lot of intelligence compared to, let's say, Hannibal, who didn't have those kinds of legions. He was working with mercenaries. He needed to have more intelligence on the Romans than the Romans needed to have on him,
Hmm.
because the Romans always had the option of kill them all. When you can commit genocide, you don't have to be spying on them. All you need to know is where they are and kill them.
Wow. Okay.
And they did that. They practically depopulated parts of Spain. In the first Jewish war in 77, they killed a million, count them, Jews. And in the second war, they shipped every Jew out of Judea north to Galilee, and they repopulated it with Romans.
Oh my gosh. I
Yep.
guess soft power and subtlety aren't really necessary when you have genocide as a viable option for
Exactly.
governance.
Exactly.
Okay, I see. So you mentioned a legion, 28 legions a minute ago. How large was a legion at that time? How many troops are we talking about?
Depending on how many auxiliaries they had attached, somewhere between 5 and 6,000.
Oh
So
wow.
that's a
Okay.
lot of people. And that shows you why, when you do have an intelligence failure, as Varus did in the Teutoburgerwald, his enemy was able to wipe out 3 entire Roman legions, every man that was there, plus change the entire course of Roman foreign policy in Germany. So when the Romans have an intelligence failure, they're not small. And in that sense, I would argue intelligence is very important. And that looking back on events like that, the Romans would say, what can we do to make sure that doesn't happen again? Because you can't afford to lose, 3 legions at a clip every
Hmm.
time you do that. And yet there are, more examples as you go on through Roman history of the Romans getting caught.
Sure. So from my own limited understanding of that period, the loss of those 3 legions that you mentioned, that was kind of like a watershed moment for the empire, wasn't it? Like it really marks a decisive change from the before and the after. Is that correct?
Yes, all of the forts along the Rhine, the ones that became permanent and were built in stone, are on the left side of the Rhine, not on the eastern side where the Germans were. And the Germans on the other side were referred to as Germania Libera, free Germany. And it not only stopped the Romans from expanding in that area, they never replaced the 3 legions. And it changed the historiography of the study of Roman history, because the British, who were occupied by the Romans and identify with them and talk about, our ancestors, the Romans, and play them up. The French identify with the Romans, especially the occupation of North Africa. These people, they don't appreciate. We're bringing them civilization, and, they're fighting against us just like they fought against the Romans. But the German historians, oh yeah, it's those Romans over there, the ones we beat. They don't identify with them the way the other groups that were occupied by the Romans do, because they were not occupied by them.
Hmm. Interesting. So we've discussed a little bit some of their failures and the way that they didn't place a huge priority on intelligence, but were there some successes that we can point to where intelligence collection did, favor for them decisively in battle or in statecraft or what have you?
Well, I guess one of the better examples would be the Hannibalic War, the Second Punic War. I wrote an article about Hannibal's spies, and he's very clever. And, Hannibal has secret codes, and he has spies infiltrating Rome. He has all kinds of secret words that they use, so he identifies his agents. He sneaks up on the Romans, he ambushes them, blah, blah, blah. But in the end, the Romans win. And the Romans win in many cases because they've intercepted Hannibal's messages. They're also able to control the communications networks in the Mediterranean. that the Romans had all the ports, so it was very hard to get a ship to go from one place to the other with a message that Hannibal would have. And when they did send them, the Romans would capture the ships, get the messages, and realize what was going on. And in the end, the offensive strategy of Scipio did it too. And Scipio, frankly, was one of the first people that is well documented at playing dirty tricks. It worked.
Hmm.
And in the end, at the Battle of Cannae, where Scipio wins, he copied exactly the tactics that Hannibal had used at the earlier battle, the last one. Cannae was the first one where Hannibal won. He did it with a double envelopment maneuver, which is like an ambush in clear sight. Copied it and used it at the last battle at Zama, and beat Hannibal at his own game. Of course, Hannibal had lost an eye by that time. He was 64 years old. Scipio was a young 20 something. And so, there might have been other factors. But the fact that Scipio had been studying Hannibal's tactics for the last 20 years paid off in the end.
Amazing. Was that a rarity at that time for the Romans to kind of take the tactics of their enemy or to learn from their enemy and use those tactics against them? It kind of sounded like it was from the way that you're describing it.
The Romans do. The Romans steal a lot. They stole other people's armor. They stole the gladius. It was copied from the Spanish. They took all kinds of things from other people. They just never gave them credit for it. They just claimed it all as their own, as, oh, we're so smart. And in fact, if you read Livio Polybius's accounts of the Second Punic War, oh, yeah, sure, they play Hannibal up to look like the greatest genius ever. Why? Because the Romans beat them in the end. That's why. So you can say, well, gee, Hannibal seemed to be this intelligence genius. Why did they lose? It's one of the reasons, because the Romans wrote the history and they played it up to make Hannibal look great and have all these clever ideas, because they knew at the end of the story they're going to say, and we beat him anyway.
Amazing stuff.
If I
I'm
can
impressed.
have one document, one or two documents back the ancient world that we haven't found, it would be the Greek histories that were written about the Second Punic War, that, the ones that were pro Hannibal.
Oh boy. Oh, that would be an interesting read, I'll bet.
Right, but none of them have survived because the Romans burnt those too.
Oh my goodness, these Romans, got to hand it to them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you mentioned earlier that they never really had anything approaching a central intelligence apparatus in the way that we think of them these days. No bureaucracy or anything like that. So how exactly did they treat intelligence? Like, how was it gathered and how was it analyzed? I mean, was it done in a way that we would recognize now?
There is no central intelligence agency. There is no FBI for internal security. But once Augustus founded the empire, he's always referred to as the architect of the Roman Empire. And he deserves that title because he designed from scratch different organizations that worked as intelligence services within the government. I'll give you an example. Many other Near Eastern and Middle Eastern powers, like the Parthians or even in Mesopotamia way back, had intelligence services that carried information from parts of the empire to the king. Romans didn't have that. So Augustus founded one. It was called the Cursus Publicus, the public road, in which, along the Roman road system that already existed, he set up a system of messengers, not with Pony Express for fastness, but men traveling in chariots or carriages that could come from the provinces to Augustus and not only carry mail with them, but to be eyewitnesses that he could question, well, what's going on in the province and what did you see and tell me about it. It was more based on reliability than it was speed. And this was not a postal service, although you'll see the word used over and over for this kind of system, but it was run by the government and it was used to carry political and military intelligence. This was not set up so you could send a birthday card to your Aunt Ruth somewhere in the empire. Private people were not allowed to even use the road system. You had to have a special pass from the government with a stamp on it that said you had the right to be on the road, and a special one that said you could be on the road and you could use the courier service. And so that is the beginning of an intelligence service in a very, very, small way that gets information from elsewhere in the empire to Augustus. Now, he already had groups in the army that did reconnaissance. There were groups called exploratores and speculatores, and they, of course, could use the road system. They could come from the battlefield to Augustus to tell him what was happening. He set up a night watch system called the Vigiles that was nominally a fire department, but they could also be used for military reasons. If you needed somebody arrested, they could be sent out and supplement
Huh.
whatever else you had. And then, of course, there's the Praetorian Guard, 9,000 soldiers dedicated to keeping Augustus and his family safe and guarding the palace. Then they could also be taken out into the field and used as couriers or used as just battlefield soldiers. If you consider all of that together, you could say, well, that those are elements of an intelligence service. You add in the urban cohorts that guarded Rome itself. We don't know how the information went, and we don't know how these groups were coordinated with each other. But we do know that the emperor was in charge, and he was the one who needed the information. So all of
Hmm.
these things could serve Augustus, but we just can't call it an intelligence service singular because it wasn't one service, it was several services. That's why I called the book Intelligence Activities in Ancient Rome, as opposed to a previous book called The Origins of Intelligence Services,
Ah, okay.
because Rome didn't have a service.
I see. I see. Interesting. Rosemary, you mentioned earlier something about Scipio was one of the very first Romans to use what you called dirty tricks at
Mhm.
that time. So was there a kind of like a moral or ethical stance against the kind of subterfuge that we associate with intelligence activities these days? I mean, were they like a straightforward, broad daylight kind of honor bound government at that time, or was there some other reason that they weren't using these kinds of dirty tricks?
Well, there are authors who have claimed that that's exactly true. I disagree. And here's why. It's a dirty business. It's always been a dirty business.
Mhm.
It's always been done. Morality has nothing to do with it. Romans, however, had very good propaganda, and they would claim to have what they call fides Romana, the Roman faith, as opposed to fides Punica, Punic faith. Those people who lie, cheat, steal, that kind of thing. And they would then use it to compare themselves, contrast themselves with the Carthaginians or whatever enemy, those Eastern folk. And it's quite Orientalist in the sense that, it's always the Eastern people that are slimy and lying. The Romans did it just as much as they did. They just simply didn't admit to it. And, dirty tricks happened all the time, but you didn't necessarily talk about it and you didn't play it up. The Romans always broadcasted the idea that we beat people face to face, mano a mano. And of course, they had the legions where they could do it, that you're not really defeated until we crush you. On the other
Ooh.
hand, it takes other dirty tricks to accomplish that too. They just don't play those up, and that's what makes my job hard. Is because if they're not talking about it, then nobody writes it down, and then you have to figure out how it was done. The Romans ambush people. People ambush the Romans. The fact that Scipio used some tricks that had been current means he learned quickly. But I'm sure there were other Romans that did it. We just don't have the histories.
By the way, I have a question for all of my listeners out there right now. Has this podcast given you a renewed interest in the history of the Cold War? Do you want to share that interest with others? Well, now there's a fun and interactive way to introduce your family and friends to the topic. I'm talking about 15-Minute Cold War, a new strategy based card game. With the 2 expansion packs currently available, or using the brand new Complete Edition, up to 10 players can battle each other for global domination. As one of the great powers during the Cold War, use your armed forces to attack opponents while defending yourself with military, scientific, and economic assets. There are also wild cards based on real events and people to keep things interesting. For example, how will Oleg Penkovsky weaken one side or strengthen another? Players don't have to know any history to start playing, Just learn the color codes and point values of each card. My 8-year-old daughter understood the game mechanics within a few minutes and has already won 2 rounds against her mom and I. You can also use the new speed tokens to boost the rate of play by up to 15% for large multiplayer games for when the Cold War turns hot. If you've heard me mention 15-minute Cold War before, there are 2 brand new updates you should know about. Starting now, any order for more than $50 gets free worldwide shipping. And if you use the discount code SPYCRAFT101, you'll get 15% off your entire order. Find it at 15mincoldwar.com. That's 15min coldwar.com, and make sure to follow at 15-Minute Cold War on Instagram.
We don't know a lot about what happened, but people have been tricking each other for a very long time. And I'm thinking of writing a book on ambush to show that the Romans did it and had it done against them. If they didn't do it, how would they know how to do it? Why would they continuously be beaten by the other side if they weren't willing to learn? Because if you draw that moral line, then somebody's going to sneak up on you and you're going to, oh, how dare you? Well, no, no. It's always been a dog eat dog world, and you use whatever advantage you can. And when the Romans do it, they refer to themselves, aren't we clever? And when the other side does it, oh my God, I can't believe those people are so dishonest.
Oh, wait. Some things haven't changed then, in that case, I suppose.
That's right.
Fascinating stuff. Besides Augustus and Scipio that you've already mentioned, was there anyone else that kind of stands out as a pioneer or a leader in advancing intelligence collection or intelligence activities at all in the Roman Empire?
Well, although he doesn't get any credit because there's very little information, but we think there's a group of grain sergeants were turned into intelligence agents. We think it was under Domitian, but the evidence mostly comes from Trajan, Hadrian, and later, that since grain is everywhere, you have to feed the army, and the army is everywhere, that these men would go from army camps to the capital, were put up in a special camp that they built just for them, and then could go back and were traveling around the empire as an intelligence service. In other words, once you already have the cursus publicus, putting the manpower on that cursus publicus to carry the intelligence, and they're in the military, enhanced the system. Later, under Diocletian, you have another group called the general agents, agentes and rebus, and they're the same thing, military. They were ranked as military, but they really weren't. They were civilian, but they gave them military titles, and they traveled around the empire. The difference being, however, from just saying, again, postal workers or something, they could carry intelligence, they had the right to arrest people, and they could be used as assassins. And they could investigate people for misusing funds. So it was like taking the CIA, the FBI, the Postal Service, and the IRS together in one organization. And if that doesn't scare you, I don't know what would.
Okay.
So as the Romans go along, they keep adding these groups to the other organizations, because the important thing is that the emperor has to know what's going on. It isn't such a tough sell with the military, because no general goes into the field with his head in a brown paper bag. Every general, especially in the ancient world where they were the ones leading the army themselves from the front, that you had to know, where is the enemy? How big is the battlefield? What are they armed with? How many of them are there? Are we going to get headed off at the pass? Because he himself could be killed. And so you see the building up of military intelligence work a lot more systematically than the empire-wide political intelligence organizations.
Okay. Did that mostly consist of what we think of as like straightforward scouting work, like a guy on a horse who's has excellent vision, something like that, and who can report back, activity that he sees? Or did it extend to building, source networks in the likely path of the army, or anything like that at all?
It starts out in the very beginning, the general does the reconnaissance himself. And they use the English word autopsy, which we use for other things. But autopsy, it means self-looking. He would do it himself, and we have reports of what he saw and how he figured out where the enemy was. Then under Caesar, we have the report of these speculatores and exploratores, and there's a bit of a debate on scholars between whether or not they existed earlier than Caesar, but we only read about them in Caesar because he's the only history we have. I suggest they probably came a lot earlier, and then they're taken into the army under Augustus. You have the same groups. Did they have more of them? There's supposed to be 10 in each legion under Caesar, but I don't know how many Augustus had. As many as they thought they needed, and so being able to do reconnaissance was something that was understood. I think if you look at the reign of Trajan, who did a lot of foreign wars, both in Dacia and Parthia, you see him very carefully when he moves into an area, doing reconnaissance, knowing where all the passes are, clearing them out before he walks into them, knowing where the enemy is, setting up the battles. And you don't see Trajan getting ambushed. And it's directly because he knew about good intelligence gathering, and he was a good general.
Hmm. Must have been, I guess, if he survived. So, Rosemary, what kind of methods did they use that we haven't already discussed that we might recognize today? Was there any building of source networks in any context that we can point to now, or did they have other methods for trying to tell what was going to be coming? Whether political intelligence or military buildups, anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are three ways of getting agents to work for you, and I don't think they've changed. One of them has always been money. Two, ideology. If you identify with the Roman Empire, or later on, if you identify with the Christian Roman Empire against wherever else you were. Or three, a grudge. Somebody did something to you and you want to get back at them, so you side with the Romans, who might be their enemy, and you get revenge. Once you know how to play those three notes, then you recruit people. And the Romans were always on the lookout for disgruntled, high ranking aristocrats from the Parthian Empire. Sometimes the Romans were less than subtle. They would simply kidnap the royal family and keep all the kids, and then send the eldest son back to rule over the country when the previous son died. But they'd always keep the kids.
Hmm.
It's sort of, they treat them very well. They'd put them up in the palace. They'd feed them. They give them clothing. They live sort of like kings, but they live like kings in exile. There is always somebody, that walks in off the street and says, "Hey, I've got some information for you that, you never can tell." You can capture assets on the battlefield. You can torture people for information, not something that we do now, at least not that I know of. Or maybe waterboarding should be reconsidered. That way, you find out where the enemy is. I have a phrase that I heard many, many years ago that said, espionage is done sometimes by spies and all the time by neighbors, relatives, and colleagues. So everybody's a potential spy, and people are nosy. In the city of Rome itself, we have a passage that describes an architect asking a man, do you want your house facing one way for privacy, or the other way so you can spy on your neighbors?
Wow.
Really?
Wow.
Wow. The people consider that. So there's always somebody looking. The question is, can you get your hands on them and get them to work for you? In some cases, it's entire tribes or groups. So if the Romans are fighting the Parthians, then any Greek city or town that is in the middle ground between the two could be a source of information for what the other side was doing.
Hmm.
And the Romans were very good at exploiting that.
Okay.
And getting information about where the enemy is, or what they're doing, what they're planning, knowing what the Parthians might be planning. There's a story under Augustus, I can't prove this, but where Augustus sends the Parthian king a slave girl as a gift. Well, it turns out she's so beautiful and so successful that the Parthian king marries her. She becomes the queen of Parthia, and her son becomes the next king. And I often wondered, did she send any information back? That would have been
Hmm.
a great plant. As it turns out, in the end, I think she went pro Parthian and was backing her son and not the Romans. But that would have been a wonderful, opportunity to have somebody on the inside.
Oh, certainly, certainly. And that kind of thing, I mean, it has happened in history. But, you make a great point, Rosemary, about what you said, that she eventually, her true loyalty is to her son over the
That,
years, which I can certainly understand.
exactly, exactly. But if you're going to put a plant in, that that would be the way to do it.
Hmm. There was one segment of your book, and it shouldn't have shocked me, but it did, honestly. And that was about the use of like divination and astrology for intelligence forecasting. I guess I should have seen that coming, honestly, but I didn't at all. Can you just talk about how those things were used a little bit for intelligence purposes?
The stories that concern the taking of the auspices come from very unreliable sources. We have Livy, and he talks about early Rome, but nobody believes the stories. They could be made up. They could have been interjected back into Roman history for their, amusement value or their moral value. But here's what we're told in the beginning: that the Romans are very superstitious. That's a fact. Before they went off to battle or took any big decision, senators, as priests, would walk up to the high point in the city and watch the flight and call of birds. And that would tell them they were, I guess, capable, they thought, of interpreting the signs from the gods. That worked fine when you were in Rome at the top of a hill that had trees and birds. But when you went off to a battlefield is usually a big flat area with no trees. That's why you're having the battle there. So they would take birds with them in the form of golden cages that held the sacred chickens. And they would open the door of the cage, they would throw down food, and the chickens would come out and eat. And if they did the normal chicken thing, like they're sloppy eaters, they peck and the grain flies and they cluck cluck cluck. If they refused to come out and eat, that was a bad sign you didn't go into battle. Now, that is a practice. That is a documented practice. But when you get towards the end of the Republic, people have gotten a little more sophisticated. Generals are not going to base their performance on chickens. In the First Punic War, we're told a general had the auspices taken, the chickens wouldn't eat. He had them shoved into cages, threw the cages overboard from the ship he was on, and drowned them, and said, fine, they won't eat, let them drink. But then he lost the battle. And Livy says, you see, this is what happens when
Oh
you
my gosh.
ignore the signs from the gods. Okay. Another way, the Etruscans were famous for being able to read the entrails of sacrificial animals. And so they would have Etruscan priests read the livers, especially. They were experts at liver reading. And you would, if there was a spot on the liver or there was something wrong with it, they would tell you either the auspices are good or bad. We are actually told that certain priests, because they knew the Romans wanted to hear something, good or bad, they could, as we say in modern parlance, cook the intelligence. So they would have let's say, a mark on their hand with ink or soot or something, and they would press it to the bottom of the wet liver, and then when they turned it over and says, you see that dark spot? This means don't go to battle, or this means this is bad. Or they would have a ring on, and they would press it into the liver, and then when they present it, they see that indentation? This is a bad sign. Or they could not do that and say it was a good sign, depending on what they thought you wanted to hear. So not only did they use these religious things, they could manipulate them.
Hmm. Amazing.
My favorite story comes from the Samnite Wars, where the general says, "Okay, take the auspices." The auspices are bad, but they know he wants to go into battle, so the priests lie and say the auspices were good. But then somebody overhearing this goes and tells him the auspices were bad. They're lying to you, and he goes, "Let me take care of this." They go into battle, and he puts the chicken handlers in the front line. And during the very first thing, the battle, a spear comes over, kills the chicken handler. And just then, a crow flies over and caws, and the general says, see, the auspices are good. The gods approve.
Oh boy.
So, although there are these superstitious practices, it doesn't mean that people paid attention. Caesar himself said, I don't believe in this nonsense, but I will not go into battle having my men think they're cursed. So we're going to take the auspices.
Oh wow. Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of
Right.
sense there.
Yeah.
Honestly, having to do it for the not theatricality, having to do it for appearances, to kind of steal the will of the men who are believers. I can totally understand that, even if the
Exactly.
commanders are very grounded in reality.
Hmm.
You have that photo in your book of the, I guess it's like an iron cast of a sheep's liver from the Etruscan priests that you mentioned, and
Yes.
that was one of the most incredible things I've ever seen.
Yes.
Honestly, the way everything is mapped out as a teaching tool to learn how to
Mhm.
read a sheep's liver, really
Exactly.
really fascinating.
Exactly. It's bronze and it's called the Piacenza liver, and people have written entire books on what it's supposed to mean. It's like reading palms. It's if you say that's what it means, fine. But it's the Etruscans continued to make a living sending priests out that did this professionally.
Hmm.
And the strange thing is, in every town in the world, there's Madame So and So at a storefront in the main street of town that will tell your fortune or read your tarot cards or your tea leaves. And really, we're still doing that. How
Hmm.
interesting! And we
I know it. I know
criticize
it.
the Romans. Yes,
Yeah, I shouldn't be like mocking these guys for the sacred chickens when there are a lot of beliefs these days that kind of would look, equally ridiculous from afar. I have to
exactly.
admit, and people believed them then, and people believe things now that
Hmm.
seem very, very odd to people from other cultures and other time periods. So,
Hmm.
who knows what they'll be mocking us for 1,000 years from now?
That's right.
Well, besides that, was there also use of things like propaganda or disinformation in the way that we recognize them now? Did they kind of sow fear or sow disinformation ahead of battle? Anything like that at all that you're aware of?
Certainly, again, the Romans having all the force they needed, if they mobilized and moved an army to a certain area, or saber rattled, it would scare the other side into not going into battle if they didn't actually have one. Anything you could solve diplomatically saved you a lot of money and manpower if you didn't have to do it. Sending diplomatic messages, I wish we had, the content of more of them. I have more examples of disinformation used in Mesopotamia than I have in the Romans, simply because we don't have enough of the actual documents themselves to know, what the Romans said. But they're quite capable of, creating false information or scaring the other side into doing something without even having to say anything, but creating the impression that they were going to do something.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that comparatively they were better or worse than their adversaries and than their near peers at the time
Well,
at that sort of thing?
again, they lasted 1,000 years. The Romans kept, as long as the Romans keep winning, then whatever they're doing is working.
That's right. That's right.
The,
I understand completely.
the thing about intelligence is that it's nice to have, but you can win without it, and you can lose with it. It's
Hmm.
not the magic bullet that if you have it and you're clever at this sort of thing, you'll automatically win, because you can be crushed just by force. You can also have bad luck, bad weather, things happen, and when you're on the battlefield, it's a crapshoot. The Romans were generally good enough to survive.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah. That's. I mean, that the record speaks for itself. Just like you said, that's really
Hmm.
amazing that they placed enough priority on it that they were able to continue on for
Hmm.
centuries more in most cases.
And here's another thing that blew my mind. The Roman Empire in the West falls in 476. You have the Ostrogoths come down, they take over the government. They adopt the intelligence service and they keep it exactly the same. And it goes into the Byzantine Empire and it stays exactly the same. Empires come and go, but the intelligence services survive, because
Hmm.
whoever takes over is going to need the same spies, the same information, and they're not going to throw those networks away. It was much like at the end of the Second World War. The Americans, there were a lot of people smuggled out of Germany that were, Germans, but were either physicists or they were spies. They were agents, Nazi agents, but those networks were important. And then, of course, between East Germany and West Germany, a lot of people got picked up by Stasi or got picked up by MI6. And you don't run out of work when you're a spy if you're good at what you do.
Mm. Yeah, I was just thinking that even before you said, I was thinking of, was it Reinhard Gehlen? I think it was, that he
Hmm.
just found a new master to serve in the immediate aftermath of World War II ending, and he and a lot of his
Exactly.
people served for many more years for a different master.
Sure. That's
And
exactly it. You're supposed to be neutral when you're collecting intelligence anyway. And so, who you collect it for shouldn't really make a difference, because you're not,
mhm.
if you're not doing it for ideological reasons for real, then you can work for anybody.
Hmm.
Here's another thing that is new. My last two books have delved into this. Nobody had ever written anything on Roman internal security. I had been writing about, the foreign powers and, the Parthians and wars with them. But the question of how did the Roman emperor protect himself? And he said, well, that's easy. The Praetorian Guard, he had 9,000 people doing it. But the Roman Empire had the highest rate of assassination of any monarchy at any time in any
Hmm.
place in the world. 75% of Roman emperors wound up dead
My gosh.
by assassination. And so I suddenly had to ask myself, how? who who in the intelligence service isn't doing their job? How did you neutralize those guards? Who was in on it? And how do you prove that there's a conspiracy? And how do you tell the difference between a conspiracy and a conspiracy theory? Because the Romans had problems with conspiracy theories also. And then can you trust the sources? Are they making up a story about it to cover up who really did it?
Hmm. Oh boy, sounds like you got your work cut out for you there.
Oh yeah, yeah. 2 books down. I'm working on a new one. So
Amazing. Amazing. I do want to go back just for a minute to the Second Punic Wars. We did talk about them briefly at the beginning, but Hannibal and Scipio, they're such a major portion of your book and of the, the better known Roman history. Anyway, can you talk a little bit more about what made Hannibal such a powerful adversary? I know that you said the Romans had a tendency to build him up after they defeated him, but does his objective record still make him a very good user of battlefield intelligence, do you think?
the, when you have two adversaries facing each other, and the Romans are one of them, the Romans, as I've said, have force on their side. They have centralization on their side. They have that legionary structure on their side. Whoever goes up against the Romans has to have intelligence, better intelligence, because you have to trick them. You have to somehow neutralize the 28 legions. So whether you lure them into a pass or you pick them off one by one in battles by ambushing them, the intelligence you collect against them is much more important than what the Romans collect about you. Hannibal was good at collecting intelligence. He was also a tactical genius. I mean, the entire war, 13 years in Italy, he never loses a battle. And he never lost one except the last one. He was clever at what he did. He tried never to get himself into the kinds of situations that he put the Romans in, luring them into a pass, luring them into a narrow area, and then slamming them because they either couldn't set up in their regular legionary formations or he was able to rain down on them from some higher area. And he kept doing it and doing it and doing it. But the problem is, in the end, he was in Italy. He couldn't get reinforcements. He finally goes back to Africa, where he hadn't been for many, many years. He didn't have the support of his own Senate. They were sending reinforcements to Sicily, to another part of the war. And so, in the end, the clever tactics on the battlefield didn't win the war. It was the strategic intelligence that the Romans had. They had the communications, they had the offensive ideas of Scipio, they had more money and manpower, and they were working with an army that they paid regularly. They weren't working with mercenaries the way Hannibal was. In central Italy, if I had been a Samnite, would I have sided with this foreign Punic person who invades and is having a great deal of success, but says, I'm only going to liberate you. I'm not going to occupy. I'm just going to liberate you from the Romans. Or do you look at the other side and you say, well, that's well and good, but when you go home, what are the Romans going to do? Are they going to come back and get us? They've already beat us once. That's how we got to be part of this empire. How do we gamble? And in the end, the people in central Italy were more afraid of the Romans than they were of Hannibal.
Hmm.
And so they remained loyal. I'm sure there were individual tribes where if Hannibal got there first, they sided with Hannibal. But then when the Romans were at the gates, they switched and sided with the Romans because it's self-preservation.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. Certainly. So was Hannibal then, could he be described as Rome's greatest adversary over the course of the entire empire? I mean, he came closer to defeating them than just about anyone, didn't he?
I would say as an individual, yes. Of course, is that because Livy writes it up that way and, they call it the Hannibalic War because he was so great? For years afterwards, Roman matrons would scare their children by saying, Hannibal's at the gates, and they'd hide under the bed and cry. That he scared the living daylights out of it. And it's true, he did bring them to the brink of military, economic, and political collapse there for a while. By the end of the war, they were literally going around in Rome asking wealthier Roman women to donate their jewelry to pay for the war effort. They had to limit the number of horses you could have drawing a carriage, how much you could spend on a dinner party, how many people you could invite. I mean, these sumptuary laws, were very, very unpopular. And it wasn't until very late in the empire that women actually went out and picketed to have them removed.
Hmm.
And I imagine there's a lot of jewelry that went into the ground too. Of people who just, I'm not turning these over. I'm keeping the diamonds. I don't care. But I mean, it changed everything, because then after the war, it was that only citizens could serve in the army, but you had to have a certain amount of income to be a citizen. And people came back and they were bankrupted. Their husbands never returned. They couldn't pay the taxes. They lost the farm. The farms got bought up by other rich, senators, who then turned them into these latifundia, and it changed the whole economic structure. And that's why when the Gracchi came in and wanted to have some sort of reform to put these men who were no longer citizens into the army back on the land so they could qualify, and then the senators stood in the way because they were squatting on the land that would be used. So I would say, from the point of view of the effect it had on the Roman state, yes, Hannibal was probably the worst, because there's no Parthian king they say, oh wow, he was really formidable. He never went into the field. He had generals who did it, and there were some clever ones, but they're not exactly household names the way Hannibal was.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Hannibal needs a movie. There's only one very old Italian film about Hannibal, and I think Hannibal needs his own film.
Oh, that would be wonderful to see. And honestly, just reading your book recently and our conversation now has really kind of ignited my interest in this history. It makes me want to go back and watch some of the series and films and all that I know are available, and honestly read a lot more nonfiction about it as well, because you're referencing so many things that I've heard of, but I couldn't tell you hardly anything about it other than what was already in your book, honestly. So it's an endlessly fascinating period, certainly.
He's so much more famous than Scipio. There's only one old biography of Scipio, and Scipio was the winner. Mm-hmm. The idea is Hannibal's the loser, and there's still more books, thousands of books about Hannibal, but the guy who actually won the war, not so much.
Amazing stuff. Well, he's certainly left a legacy. Even if he did ultimately lose, he certainly left a legacy. I mean, it's hard to imagine that somebody will still be talking about you or I 2,000 years from now, something like that. But a rare few like him, they achieve that.
Right. And if you go to Switzerland today and you go through the Alps, every single pass has, the Hannibal Hotel. They all think, oh, he came this way. No, he came that way. Everybody wants to claim Hannibal.
Oh, my gosh. Interesting. Well, yeah, I would love to see some of that. I would love to recreate that journey a little bit. That's amazing stuff, honestly. So, Rosemary, you mentioned that you're working on another book right now about Roman internal security. Is that correct?
Yes. I wrote a book about the Roman internal security under the Julio-Claudians, which means the first 5 Roman emperors. And then I wrote a second book on the Flavians that's coming out during this year, sometime later, probably in the fall. And I'm working on one now that sort of starts with the 5 good emperors and ends with the Commodus and the sort of the beginning of the fall.
My gosh, you got a full plate then, don't you?
Oh, yeah.
That's wonderful. What's
Never
the title of the book coming out in the fall?
The one coming out is called Guarding the Caesars, Roman Internal Security in the under the Flavian dynasty. The first one was called Kill Caesar, Roman Internal Security in the Julio-Claudian.
Great. I'll definitely have to look for those in this case. This is your only book so far that I have read, although I've read a few of your articles as well, but I can see that there's a lot more to dive into after this, and I'm really looking forward to that.
Well, they're on Amazon, and I have an Amazon page, so anything that people want to read as far as books, if they want copies of articles, I have many of them on academia.com, but I also would be happy to send people electronic copies if they contact me.
Fantastic. Sure. I'm sure that some people would like that very much. So, by the way, do you have any like public social media pages or anything like that, or is it mostly on academia and on Amazon right now?
It's only academia and Amazon. I'm not a media star, I'm afraid. Bit of a Luddite when it comes to electronic things, but I used to have a web page when I was at VMI, but now I just do email and write books.
Okay, great. Well, honestly, that's not a bad way to live. Believe me, there's a little bit too much social media these days, and I say that as someone that practically makes a living on it already.
Right.
But
I mean,
it's a double-edged sword.
I've done radio broadcasts for NPR. I've done TV. I've done the History Channel. I occasionally make the appearance out in the real world, but mostly I'm here doing research. It's safer.
Right? Didn't I see that you were on an episode of Modern Marvels at some point? I believe.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, I haven't looked at that one yet, but I'm gonna have to look it up after this.
Hmm.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Rosemary. This has been a really, really fun talk, and it was a wonderful read as well. So I look forward to learning a lot more about ancient history, ancient Rome as well, because this is just such a fascinating topic, honestly. And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about it today.
Well, thank you. It's been great fun. And as I said, if anybody wants to contact me for more information or articles, I'd be happy to talk to them.
Okay, great. I really appreciate it. I'll definitely stay in touch with you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Take care. If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my pages on Instagram at Spycraft 101 and at cold.war.stamps. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.